Good afternoon, everyone. And we will start this afternoon with the Refuge and Bodhichitta prayer, which we've been doing mostly in Tibetan, occasionally also reciting it in English. And I've just sort of started and done it, figuring, well, anyone who's going to watch this webcast is probably already Buddhist and probably knows something about Tibetan Buddhism and knows what we're doing. And I don't want to go through the hassle of printing things and sending them out and getting it all ready. We'll just do what I think most people already know, which is kind of a lazy approach, and probably one that actually is wrong, because frankly, even if you're Buddhist, you probably don't even really understand what we're saying. Even if you know Tibetan, to actually really understand the meaning is not so easy. And so before we begin, I'll just speak a few moments about this prayer. And I'll do it using the words in English. When we recite it in Tibetan, the meaning is the same. So until enlightenment, I go for refuge to the Buddhas, Dharmas, and the sublime Sangha. So this means, the main point here is we're going for refuge, which means we're seeking protection. And we're seeking protection from the sufferings of samsara. Because we recognize, we look at our own experience and we realize this is painful. It's samsara. The nature of samsara is painful, as we discussed at length when we were speaking about the third chapter. So we need a way out of it. But if we already knew the way ourselves, we wouldn't need to take refuge. We'd just get out of samsara, however you do that. But because we don't know how to free ourselves from the suffering of samsara, and most of the things that we try actually end up maybe bringing us temporary relief. But even that's uncertain. Some of them bring temporary relief and then long-term suffering. Some of them bring sort of medium-term relief and then long-term suffering. So we just don't know what we're doing on our own. So we need a guide, someone who has liberated themselves from samsara, to show us the way. And that guide is the Buddha. So we go for refuge to the Buddhas as our teacher, the person who can teach us how to get out of samsara. And the teachings for getting out of samsara are what we call the Dharma. It's a Sanskrit word. And it has many different things that it means. They give 10 different meanings in Sanskrit. But really, when we use it with 3 or 4 different meanings sometimes. But when you use the word in English, generally we mean like the teachings of a religion. So sometimes in Hinduism they talk about Dharma. I think even in Sikh the Sikh religion talks about Dharma. In Buddhism we talk about Dharma. So what we mean by Dharma are the teachings. The teacher, the Buddha, teaches us teachings, and we're going to follow those teachings. The teachings are the path that we need to follow to get from where we are to liberation. Of course, getting from here to liberation doesn't mean you actually go anywhere. It's not like you have to go anywhere else. You actually just have to realize what's happening in your own mind. And so we have to follow the teachings of the Buddha to do that. But we don't have the ability to all go for teachings with the Shakyamuni Buddha because he passed away 2,600 years ago. But we do have the Sangha. The word Sangha has a couple of different meanings. And the first meaning, one of the first meanings in Buddhism was a gathering of 4 or more bhikkhus, or fully ordained monks. And then later 4 or more bhikkhunis, fully ordained nuns. But it also refers to those beings who have seen the truth of the 4, in the context of the Abhidharma that we're talking about. This means they've seen the nature of the 4 noble truths. In the context of the Mahayana, we talk about them as the bodhisattvas who see in the meaning of emptiness. So they're what we call noble beings, and so that's the noble Sangha, or the noble community, the noble gathering, the noble order, however you want to translate the word Sangha. So in the prayer we say, until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddhas, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. The sublime Sangha here means the Sangha of bodhisattvas, because we're practicing Mahayana Buddhism, even though we're studying Foundation Vehicle. And then the length of time that we go for refuge is we recognize that achieving unexcelled enlightenment is going to take a long time. We don't really know what's going to happen in our next lifetime, but we kind of like fake it and have confidence, like, I don't care if it's going to happen or not. Doesn't matter. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to make the promise now. And if I make the promise now, I've got a chance of keeping it. If you don't make a promise, if you don't make the commitment, you aren't going to have a chance of keeping it. Something might happen and it works out, but that's very, very rare. So you make the promise, I'm going for refuge, not just this lifetime, but every lifetime from here until I achieve enlightenment. And so this is the Mahayana Refuge, going for refuge from now until we achieve the state of Buddhahood. And we go for refuge to the teacher, the Buddha as our teacher, the Dharma as the teachings or path, and the Sangha as our companions on the path. And then it says, by the merit, now there are different versions of this third line. There are 3 or 4 different versions I've seen in Tibetan. And so the one that we have says, by the merit of being generous and so forth, or you could say by the merit of my acts of giving and so forth. And difference in words, but it's kind of the same. Basically, by the merit of doing the virtuous activities of what we call the 6 transcendences: generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, dhyana, or deep meditation, which we've been talking about, and prajna, or the discernment that's able to distinguish dharma from non-dharma. So by practicing those 6, I will become a Buddha to help beings. So we're going to become a Buddha. And why do we want to become a Buddha? In order to benefit sentient beings. So that's the meaning of the prayer. So now please keep that meaning in mind as we recite the words of this prayer. Oh, until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of being generous and so forth, may I become a Buddha to help beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of being generous and so forth, may I become a Buddha to help beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of being generous and so forth, may I become a Buddha to help beings. May all sentient beings be happy and of the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they dwell in the highest joy, free of all suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free of attachment or aversion for those near or far. In the Dharma expanse palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas of the 3 times, who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to my glorious root gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. So now think to yourself that if we are going for refuge to the Buddhas, Dharma, and Sangha until enlightenment, we don't reach enlightenment unless we do something about it ourselves. The Buddha can't give us anything. And so it's only through our own efforts that we can achieve Buddhahood. So for that reason, we go through the efforts of the path of listening and contemplating and meditating. And yet, if we only do this for our own sake, we'll never get anywhere. And so we do this for the benefit of all sentient beings. The bigger our motivation, the more likely we are to go further. And so think to yourself now that it is in order to bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space, to the state of perfect Buddhahood, that we are engaging in Dharma practice. And in order to practice the Dharma, liberation and enlightenment comes from meditation practice. And yet, if we just sat down and do meditation practice without understanding anything, we won't get very far. So we need to listen. Once we've listened, we need to contemplate so that we can develop certainty. And so please think to yourself that today we are listening to the Dharma in order to bring all beings to Buddhahood. And with this motivation of Bodhichitta, please listen to these teachings. The Dharma that you are listening to is the Treasury of Abhidharma by the great being Vasubandhu. This is his treatise, the verses on the Treasury of Abhidharma. There are 8 chapters in the verses on the Treasury of Abhidharma. Of the 8 chapters, we are discussing this year in this class, we are discussing the 3rd and 4th chapters. So we have finished the 3rd chapter, the 3rd area, or teachings on the world. And so we are now discussing the 4th area, the presentation of karma, or teachings on karma, as it's officially called. And this 4th area begins with a description of how all worlds arise from karma. Then it has a teaching on, what does it have? I better look before I say it incorrectly. How everything arises from karma. Understanding, the 2nd section is understanding karma itself. And 3rd is teaching the synonyms of dharmas as a summary. So we've completed the 1st, and we're in the 2nd, the understanding karma itself, which has 3 sections. And that the 1st is identifying karma, identifying actions. When you think karma, think action, right? And so identifying karma, and then there's the presentation of karma, and the meaning of karma as explained in the sutras. So we are in the 2nd, the presentation of karma, which has, again, 3 subsections, classifying karmas in 2. The presentation of the general features of the 3 karmas, and the presentation of imperceptible karma. So we are now talking about the general teachings of the the presentation of the general features of the 3 karmas. And so the 3 karmas here are volition, perceptible karmas of body and speech, and imperceptible karmas of body and speech. This teaching on the presentation of the general features of these 3 karmas has 2 topics, presenting the actual meaning, and 2nd, explaining motivation in detail. We've talked about the first already, so we're talking about motivation. Motivation in detail. And we began that the other day. There are 3 topics: classification of motivation, the nature of each classification, and examining the 4 possibilities of their Dharma basis. So the classification of the motivation, so when we look at the motivations, there are the 2 types. There's the causal motivation and the contemporaneous motivation. So the causal motivation is what we call the instigator, as it says. The first one is the instigator, the 2nd is the executor. The word executor in English has 2 pronunciations, and I got confused the other day. Which pronunciation is which? When you say executor, that means the one that's doing something. When you say executor, that means the one who's handling your estate or your literary affairs. So here we're talking not about literary affairs, we're talking about someone doing something. So the executor, so the instigator, that means the motivation that initially you think, I want to do something. And then you have the executors, the motivation that you actually have at the moment you're doing. So that's the basic idea. So between these two. Well, now, when we have these two, the executor and the instigator and the executor, what types? We've got the question of what types of mind can be instigators? What types of mind can be executors? What types of mind can be both instigators and executors? We've got to look at it. We've got to be able to examine our motivations well. And so that's what this is talking about, examining the four possibilities of their Dharma basis. And the Dharma base, and this is when I revise this translation, I'm probably going to change this term because it's not one that's particularly clear. The four possibilities of these phenomena. The different types of minds. When you've got the basic, when you have different types of cognition, you've got some that can be instigators, some that can be executors, some that can be both, and some that are neither. So there are four possibilities. So what are the ones that are one, and what are the ones that are both? And that's the essence of this section. So the first is the possibility of being only the instigator. Second is the possibility of being both instigator and executor. The third is the possibility of only being the executor. And the fourth is the possibility of analyzing the way they mutually engage. And the fifth is the possibility of being neither instigator nor executor. Now, when we talk about this, we're going to get into it. It sounds like there's a lot of technical words going on. You're going to think, what does this mean? So you have to bear with the technical words because they're important points that we can actually look and understand in our words. So when we talk about discards of seeing, or something that seeing discards, what does that mean? Well, we have to explain that. The consciousness that seeing discards is the instigator. The consciousness that seeing discards. What this means those types of mind, cognitions, that are discarded, that is, abandoned, when we see the nature of the Four Noble Truths. So seeing discards, we spoke about this a little bit the other day. As you go through the path, when you go through the path of accumulation, and we've got 5 paths, right? We've got accumulation, joining. So this is accumulation is like basically getting ready. Joining is training. Seeing is when you actually see the nature of the truths. Then meditating is when you kind of train yourself or accustom yourself, cultivate that. And then no more learning is the path when you're done. So in the first 2 paths, accumulating and joining, you don't actually discard anything. You suppress it, or you decrease it so that it doesn't come up. For example, if you have habits of getting angry as you go through the path of joining, those habits will go less and less until finally you won't get angry, visibly. But you still have anger inside of you. Well, anger necessarily wasn't the best thing. Anger it takes a long time to eliminate all your anger. Maybe I should use a different one. The idea of a self, personality view. So we have that. It gets less and less. We get a little bit, but we still have kind of a conceptual idea of selflessness. We don't have really that. And then when you get to the path of seeing, you see the nature of the Four Noble Truths. You realize that everything is impermanent, impermanent, suffering, selfless, and empty. And at that point, you see everything selfless, and then, of course, there's no view of a self anymore. It's just gone, according to the Great Exposition School. And so that level of discard is discarded at the path of seeing. But when you're talking about deeper levels of the discards, deeper levels of obscuration, they take more time to get out. And so those are the ones that are discarded by meditation. So you've got kind of 2 levels. You've got the kind of gross discards, the gross obscurations that are a little bit, they're basically conceptual. They're kind of made up. Those are the discards of seeing. And then you've got the deeply ingrained habits. Those are the discards of meditation. That's kind of an easy way to make the distinction. But the discards of seeing, even though they are less deeply set, than the discards of meditation. They can still motivate you to do action, but they can only act as the instigator. They don't function as the executor. Okay? So we'll go over why in just a moment. So that's what this is saying. The consciousness that seeing discards is the instigator. So in particular, there are many discards of seeing, but the three main ones you can think about are personality view, that is the view of a self. That would be like extreme view is the one that was given the other day. Or you could say the view of over-esteeming discipline and austerity. That's a different chapter. But at any rate, extreme views and doubt. Now, there are a bunch of other ones, but those are the three kind of most famous ones that you give up at the those are the ones, often we refer to these three fetters that you give up in the path of seeing. So personality view, wrong view, and doubt. And then along with them, there are certain levels of attachment and so forth that are also related at that time. It's not just those three. There are also attachment, anger, pride, envy, and so forth on different levels. So the consciousness that seeing discards is the perceptible's instigator only, because the causal motivation is a motivation that is basis for consideration and examination. So here, what it's saying, you've got, in order to perform an action, as we spoke about the other day, you have to have the both considering and examination. So when you have these discards, these consciousnesses that are discards of seeing, then they have consideration and analysis, and that is kind of the basis for engaging in the action. But another feature of them is that they're kind of directed inward. They're not looking so much outward, they're looking inward. For example, like with a personality view. Personality view is looking at your body and mind and saying me or mine, right? So you look at your body, and I look at this and I say, white. Someone else looks at their body and they say, Asian. Another person looks at their skin color and they say, black. Whatever you say. Actually, it's just skin. That idea, white, Asian, black, is an idea that we've made up. Then you can look at it and say, you could look at your mind and say, I have an eternal soul. This might be something that you're taught when you're little, when you go to, if you're brought to Sunday school or brought to wherever. You might have this idea. This is something you learn. So a lot of these are ideas that we learn. And so these are all types of consciousness that are looking in. When you have doubt, you're kind of looking inward. Do I believe this or not? Do I know what I do? And so they're focused inward. They're not focused outward. So the consciousnesses, the discards of seeing are focused inward. And because they're focused inward, then they can get you to do something. But at the actual time that you're doing the action, your attention is focused outward at what you're acting on, right? So they can't act as the executor. This is what the next sentence says. At the time that the executor is looking outward, the 6 groups of consciousnesses arise in succession. So the earlier motivation that looked inward does not exist and thus cannot be the executor. So the consciousnesses are going one after another, and that one that was looking inward, and it might have only been looking inward just a moment before you do the action, but the actual moment you're doing the action, you're focused outward on doing the action. For example, if your view of a permanent soul leads you to think that you need to sacrifice chickens to God, or sheep, I guess if we go, that sheep was the great example in Western thought, both for the Greeks and in Greek history and in Judaism. They sacrifice sheep. You read about this all the time, and goats. So you're going to sacrifice a sheep or a goat. You may be thinking about sacrificing your sheep or goat as an offering to God. This is based on a wrong view and personality view and so forth. But at the moment that you're actually slitting the throat, you're looking at the sheep. You're looking at the goat, right? So that's the difference. So the earlier motivation that looked inward does not exist and thus cannot be the executor. I should also note that the sacrifices in Judaism don't seem to be happening as much as they did before the destructions of the temples. But I don't know anything about, I really know nothing about Judaism. I should just stop talking before I get in trouble. I'm just trying to think of examples. I hope I have not offended anyone. The possibility of being both. So that's seeing, discards of seeing can be both, it can only be the instigator. So are there types of mind that can be both the instigator and the executor? And the mind that is a discard of meditation is both. And of the different kinds of mind consciousness, those that are a discard of meditation are both instigator and executor because they engage when focused outward and inward. So the discards of meditation are deeper level of afflictions. They are not based on the false ideas that you give up when you see the path of seeing, and so therefore they can both focus inward and they can focus outward. So they can both act as the instigator, that is the causal motivation, and as the executor, the contemporaneous motivation. And then there's, this has to be mind consciousness. This would be the sixth mental consciousness only. So those in the sixth mental consciousness that are discards of meditation. This is an important distinction because they can be thoughts in the mind, right? But when you get to the five sensory consciousnesses, those are non-conceptual. It's just like when you have an eye consciousness, you look and you see, that eye consciousness isn't thinking. That's later. That's your mind consciousness that thinks. So it's that thinking consciousness that can be both. And it can focus both outward and inward. The possibility of only being the executor, the five are executors. The five sense consciousnesses are only executors because they're thought-free consciousnesses. In other words, they can't look in the point of an eye consciousness, the function of an eye consciousness is to see forms that are outside. When you hear sounds, I guess you can hear internal sounds. You can, if you block your ears, you can hear various sounds and so forth. But generally, we hear external sounds. We feel things that are, feeling is hard. But they're focused outward. Even when they're feeling bodily sensations, they're not, it's kind of focusing out instead of looking in at the nature, at their own nature. So undefiled consciousness is neither because it rests in equipoise, looks inward, and is exclusive of engagement. So undefiled consciousness means the truth of the path. This means that once you have seen the nature of the Four Noble Truths, while you're seeing the nature of the Four Noble Truths, and then later when you're on the path of meditation and you are sitting in meditation looking at the nature of the Four Noble Truths and meditating upon them, as you do that, you're in meditation. And so it's not, because you're sitting in meditation, they do not motivate action. They look inward and they're exclusive of engagement. So it's like they're directed away from samsara, and karma and activity is directed to samsara. So these are the two things. We've got the instigators and we've got the executors. So the instigators are the causal motivations that you're thinking about beforehand. The executors are the motivations you have at the point. So we've got a bunch of different consciousnesses that can be at the different times. So that's the one thing, is kind of what level of consciousness you have. So when you find yourself thinking about that, you can look at sort of what is motivating you to do something. Is it a learned idea that would be like a discard of seeing? Is it a deeper habit? That's one way you can look at it. But something that's actually more beneficial for us, or easier to, maybe not more beneficial, but that's easier for us to put into practice, is to kind of look at the causal motivation and the contemporaneous motivation to see what are their characters. Are they, not their characters, what's their quality? Are they virtuous, unvirtuous, or neutral? So the possibility of analyzing the way they mutually engage, this has 2 points. The general is the executors from the virtuous and other instigators are threefold. So this means you can have virtuous, unvirtuous, and neutral executors, and you can have virtuous, unvirtuous, and neutral instigators. So you can have the virtuous, unvirtuous, and neutral causal motivations, and the virtuous, unvirtuous, and neutral contemporaneous motivations. And so it's important for us to be mindful and aware and to look at what's happening in our mind as we're doing actions. Because whether the action is going to be virtuous, unvirtuous, or mixed is going to depend on our motivation. It depends on the motivation more than on the external form of the action. Additionally, it is not, the commentary here reads, additionally, it is not definite that the instigator and the executor are similar. The executors that come from the virtuous and other non-virtuous and neutral instigators are also threefold. So that means here, you've got a virtuous instigator, that is, a virtuous causal motivation. When you're actually executing the action, you can have a virtuous contemporaneous motivation, a neutral contemporaneous motivation, or even a non-virtuous contemporaneous motivation. And similarly, so these executors can be either virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral, so there are a total of 9 combinations. That is 3 times 3 equals 9, right? 3 squared. For example, the vows of individual liberation have a mental factor of virtuous intention as their causal motivation. You think to yourself, I want to become a monk. I want to become a nun. I want to take the 5 precepts. That's a virtuous motivation. For the contemporaneous motivation at the time of the ceremony, however, either the continuation of that motivation, that is, the initial motivation was virtuous, so that's a continuation to be virtue. Hatred, or the mind or the path of activities might be manifest. So the attainment of the vow could be any one of these. So what this is saying, you make your motivation, I'm going to take the 5 lay precepts. Most of you are lay practitioners, so I'll say 5 lay precepts. You think you're going to do this. And then you get to the ceremony, and the master is giving the ceremony. You take it, and throughout the ceremony, you have this feeling, I need to achieve liberation. I have to take these vows of individual liberation in order to achieve liberation. This is an excellent thing I'm doing. I'm doing this to achieve liberation. And you keep that virtuous motivation in mind all the way through the ceremony. So that's the virtuous causal motivation and the virtuous contemporaneous motivation, right? The next option, you have the virtuous causal motivation, you're feeling good and virtuous until you get to the place, and then you get in, and the master is giving the ceremony in Tibetan, and they're in a rush, and you don't know what's going on, and everyone's prostrating and doing this, and you're saying there's all this, you have no idea what's going on, and so you're just sort of following along and blabbing out the words. And you're not thinking about anything. This is actually pretty common when we give the vows in Tibetan. So that is neutral. That just thinking about moving your body and moving your lips to repeat after the master is path of activities. You're working about just doing various things. So that is a neutral motivation. So that's a virtuous motivation, a causal motivation, and a neutral contemporaneous motivation, right? And then the third is when you have this virtuous motivation, you hear that some master is giving these, you're going to go and you get there, and not only are you taking the vows, your worst enemy, your ex, whoever it is also taking the vows, and they're sitting right next to you. And you are so consumed with your dislike for that person that your mind is filled with dislike as you take the vows. And so that would be an unvirtuous motivation. Another virtue, another motivation that you might have, more likely than hatred, is when you think, now I'm taking these vows. And it's, I think, more common with monastic vows, actually. Now I'm taking nuns' vows. Now I'm taking monks' vows. And now I'm going to be a monk. Now I'm going to be a nun. And that's a motivation of pride. So it's really important when you're looking at it. Then with the vows, we can see it pretty clearly. It's a virtuous motivation to begin with. And then when you're taking the vow, your motivation should be pure. I want to do this to achieve liberation. I've been in samsara for too long. I want to achieve liberation, so that's a vow of the wish for liberation. Or if you have the idea, not only have I been in liberation, if I take these vows, I'll be better able to practice bodhicitta. I'll have the basis. You can't take the bodhisattva vow without a vow of personal liberation. You have to have one of these first. And once you have one of these, then you've given up harming other sentient beings, and that is the basis. Before you actually can take the bodhisattva vow, you first have to give up harming other sentient beings. So you have to take the personal vows of personal liberation or individual liberation. Then you take the bodhisattva vow. So you might have that idea, I'm taking these vows now so that I can become a bodhisattva. And that's an excellent motivation. That being said, there are many people who show up and who take vows, and they end up taking vows with the neutral motivations, like everyone else is taking vows, I think I should too. You kind of go on, or maybe you aren't sort of certain, you think, this is probably a good thing to do, you're a little bit of doubt there. And if you do that, it's okay. It's not bad, it's actually good. And so you go and you take the vows with as good a motivation as you can. So that's when we're using that example of vows, but we can use this example, we can use the same, and we really should look at this with any action that we're going to do. For example, what it really means is you have to be mindful and aware and careful. Mindful means that you need to remember what you should do and what you shouldn't do. You should remember to have a good motivation. Being aware means that you know what your motivation, that you actually look in your, mindfulness reminds you to look in your mind and see what's going on, and being aware says, oh, my motivation isn't as good as I thought it should be, and then you can remind yourself. This is why we begin all our teachings with that, with the refuge in bodhicitta. And then carefulness is the quality of really valuing being mindful and aware, thinking it's important to do things with virtuous motivations. So the point is that not only should you think about things at the beginning, but you should also be mindful, aware, and careful at the time that you're actually doing actions. And that's, I think, the real practical point that comes from this. It's an important point because it's so easy to go and do things, and when you get carried away, especially, right now it's not such a big issue because we can't really gather in large groups, but sometimes you find yourself in a big assembly of people and you kind of just let yourself be carried away. Sometimes that also carries away your mind, and your motivation also gets turned good because you're with a group of people who are all reciting the puja. And sometimes you're just sitting there and you're just doing it because everyone's doing it. So you've got to look in your mind. So that's really the main point if you're looking at your mind, both at the time that you initially decide to do something and at the time you're actually doing it. Now, of these three, we've got virtuous, unvirtuous, and neutral, right? So if you're finding yourself, you're deciding to do something, look at your motivation. This is the causal motivation, right? Look at the motivation. If the motivation is anger, spite, contentiousness, pride's a big one. Envy, something like that, forget it, don't do it. Or work on changing your motivation. Even if it's something that looks on the outside like it's good. Look at your motivation first. If your motivation is bad, either don't do the action or change your motivation. Then when you get to but if you have a neutral motivation, you look at it, it's an action that's good on the outside, you have a neutral motivation, then if you look at your motivation, say it's neutral, then think about it. Try to get a virtuous motivation. So, because what we want is to have a virtuous causal motivation, because if you have a virtuous causal motivation, then the action has a better chance of being virtuous. And when you're thinking about doing something, there's kind of like a propulsion that this is. It's called the instigator. It makes you do something. Juparcheba in Rabdu Juparcheba, Kazano Juparcheba in Tibetan. So it's like making you do something. So if you have a strong virtue, then that virtue is more likely to carry on. So you look at your mind and you decide to do something, and you realize it's virtuous, you think that's good, and then try to make it even more virtuous if you can. I mean, don't try too hard, and be honest with yourself, but try to do better. Then when you get to the time of action, so let's say that you've decided not to do it if your motivation was bad. If it's neutral, you've changed your motivation, then you've got the virtuous motive. So you've got a virtuous causal motivation. Then when you get to the actual moment of doing the action, remember that even if you start out with a virtuous causal motivation, the contemporaneous motivation can change and often does. Most often it slips into neutral. Occasionally it slips. If you have a strong virtuous motivation, it's less likely to become strong virtuous causal motivation. It's less likely to be unvirtuous at the time of actually doing it, the contemporaneous motivation. But it is possible. So again, you have to be mindful, aware, and careful. And if you find yourself at that point having a non-virtuous motivation, what do? You stop. You don't do it. If your motivation is bad, you shouldn't act. If you can change it to a good motivation, then you do it with a good motivation. And if you can't, refrain. Even if it's an act that looks good on the outside, if your motivation is bad. If it's a neutral motivation, which often happens because we get distracted, then be mindful, aware, and careful. Often what happens is we have the neutral motivation at that time because we've got distracted. And so you just remind yourself. And then when you think about why you're doing it, then your motivation will naturally become virtuous again. And if you have a virtuous motivation, that's what we want. Because if you have the virtuous causal motivation, the virtuous contemporaneous motivation, then everything is going to go smoother. But because we are ordinary individuals, you are going to find that you have all three at both times. So you just be mindful and aware, and you gradually train your mind. You gradually have this idea. You don't want to try to force yourself to do anything, right? Because if you try to force yourself to always be virtuous and be goody two-shoes about it, it's not really going to help. You got to be aware of what you are. You've got to think about the benefits of acting virtuously, the benefits for yourself, bringing happiness to yourself, the benefits for the others, the benefits of helping others be happy. You think about the problems that come from acting out of an unvirtuous motivation, the problems that come for yourself, the problems that come for others, the difficulties that they bring for others. And if you think about those and you just can reflect on the nature of your own experience, because this is not hidden to us, we just have to think about it. And so as you do that, then you'll be able to train your mind so that you're going to be more likely to act in virtuous ways. So this teaching on, excuse me, this teaching on these two motivations is really an important one for us to actually put into practice when we're doing things. If we look at the Abhidharma in an academic way, then this is simple, very easy to understand. Okay, you've got two sets of motivations. They can go either three ways. They can go this way. Yeah. Okay, 9 possibilities. Fine, it's easy. But what the point is that we've got to train ourselves so that our actions are good causal motivation, good contemporaneous motivation. We want to avoid completely non-virtuous motivations, and we want to decrease the neutral motivations as much as we can, because the more our minds are directed towards virtue, the more we're going to train ourselves in that way, right? We're making habits, neuroplasticity and all that. We're just training our minds in virtue. So we have to use this as much as we can. So that's why we always begin every teaching, and when you begin meditations and so forth, you should begin with a motivation of bodhicitta. It's also something you can do when you wake up in the morning. first thing you do is, if you think about a motivation, think, I'm going to use my body, speech, and mind in virtue from now until enlightenment. I'm going to use my body, speech, and mind in virtue from now until the end of this lifetime. I'm going to use my body, speech, and mind in virtue from now until this time tomorrow. If you have that thought in the morning, that trains your mind so that then when you're making decisions to act, you habituated yourself, right? This is all about habituating the mind. And I better go along with the text or we'll not get anywhere. Should we? Afterward. The sages are alike or virtuous. The sage's instigator and executor are alike because his virtue engages out of virtue and neutral engages out of neutral. The sage means the Buddha. So when the Buddha has a virtuous causal motivation, then the Buddha will have a virtuous causal contemporaneous motivation, right? When the Buddha has a neutral causal motivation, such as the motivation to walk, the motivation to sit, then, at the time of the action, the Buddha also has a neutral motivation. This is according to the Great Exposition. The word or is a conjunction. Well, okay. This is again dealing with Sanskrit grammar. When you read these Sanskrit commentaries, and even when they're translated in Tibetan, they have all these words. And so this is just picked up. It means that there's an alternate. There's an alternate here. The alternate is, alternatively, following a neutral instigator, that is, following a neutral causal motivation, the executor, the contemporaneous motivation, is virtuous. But after a virtuous instigator, there can only be a virtuous executor and never a neutral one, because it is impossible that the Buddha's powers could decrease. So here, what this is saying is that the Buddha could have a neutral motivation to walk that would then turn into neutral causal motivation that would then become a virtuous causal motivation. Now here there's an interesting debate in the auto commentary. It talks about how the Buddha actually always is in equipoise. And because the Buddha is always in equipoise, then the Buddha always has a virtuous motivation. So this is this is a view, and most Mahayana schools agree with this, and also some schools at the time of some of the original 18 schools also had this position too. There's a quote from a sutra, and now I'm going to forget the quote. Basically it is, when the elephant is walking, he is in equipoise. And the elephant here means the Buddha. He is an elephant because he is always great. He is always virtuous, so he is called an elephant. When the elephant is walking, the elephant is in equipoise. When the elephant is sitting, the elephant is in equipoise. When the elephant is lying down, the elephant is in equipoise. The elephant is always in equipoise, essentially. Now, I didn't get that quote exactly right, but it's basically the idea. The Buddha or the elephant is always in meditation. But the Great Exposition school says that this isn't necessarily so, because this is, of course, it is in general true, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily always virtuous, because the Buddha can also engage in neutral actions such as sitting, eating, and so forth. And the Buddha can also make emanations, and the mind of emanations is a neutral mind. When you are emanating a form of another Buddha or another whatever, that is a neutral state of mind. Therefore, the Buddha can have neutral motivations, they say. But when they start out with a neutral motivation, then the neutral causal motivation, then there could be a virtuous executor. And now here's the next important point. The possibility of being neither. So the possibility of being neither means the possibility of being neither the causal motivation nor the contemporaneous motivation. We already had one of those, undefiled consciousness, but now we have another one that's more germane to us right now. Those born of ripening are neither. Those cognitions that are born of full ripening are neither instigator nor executor. That is, neither the causal motivation nor the contemporaneous motivation, because they're born naturally without effort. In other words, when you engage in an action, it is not the ripening of karma. When you're so the ripening of karma. So ripening here refers to the ripening of karma. So this means you've accumulated a karmic act in the past, and that result ripens on you. When that result ripens on you, that result is actually always neutral. It's never virtuous. It's never unvirtuous. It's a neutral thing. It's an experience. For example, a result of karmic ripening could be that you have a heart attack due to a congenital heart defect. It could mean that you have cancer due to a congenital thing. It could mean that you were born in a time when there was a pandemic and therefore you caught some disease. Now, it's hard to tell whether something is the ripening of karma or not, but basically what we're saying is that the ripening of karma is an experience that happens to you. That's why it doesn't have any effort. It's like you're walking down the street and the piano falls on your head. And that's the ripening of karma. You didn't do anything. Or you happened to be born in a wealthy family in a wealthy society. That's the ripening of karma. The mind that experiences that experience is neutral, and it's not deciding to do something. So because that's what ripening of karma is, this means that when you are doing an action, you cannot blame it on karma. My karma made me do it. Bad excuse. Karma doesn't let you off the hook for your own motivations and for your own actions. It's important to understand this. Karma doesn't determine anything about your actions. You may have strong habituation, and of course habituation and karma are kind of related because the more you do something, the more of a habit you're going to get. But it's not ripening of karma. It's a habit, and habits can be changed. Sometimes it's difficult, but habits can be changed. So this is an important thing to remember, that karma doesn't make you do anything. It doesn't give you the idea to do anything. It doesn't function at the karma doesn't make you do it at the time you're doing something. You can be sort of propelled by habits of ignorance and so forth, but that is different than the ripening of karma. It's an important distinction to keep in mind. You can't say, my karma made me do it. Okay. So that is the discussion of the general features of the three karmas. That completes that, talking about motivation in detail. And I've gone through motivation in a little bit more time because it's very important, and something we can actually work with. But we'll go a little bit into the next section anyways. The next section is the presentation of imperceptible karma. And this has two topics: an overview of the classifications, that is the general types, and second is the B is the extensive presentation. The overview of the classifications: three types of imperceptibles are vows, wrong vows, and neither. So there are three types of imperceptible forms. One is vows. Now, vows, the second type is wrong vows, and the third is neither, that is mid-vows, that are neither vows nor wrong vows. So the commentary says there are said to be three types of imperceptibles. They are either vows that bind the continuum of immorality. Now here, this is a commentary that is based upon the meaning of the Sanskrit and the Tibetan words, as I've mentioned a couple of times in previous days. The Tibetan word dompa and the Sanskrit word samvara mean binding or restraints. So they restrain you, they keep you from doing immoral acts, and so therefore they are vows. So when we talk about vows, we are only talking about virtuous, imperceptible forms that prevent you from doing unvirtuous actions. Wrong vows that arise as extremely harmful conduct of body and speech. So a wrong vow is the opposite of that. It's like committing to do something harmful. For example, it would be the example, I guess I said a couple examples the other day. If you take a job at a slaughterhouse butchering chickens or pigs or whatever you're going to butcher. If you sign up as a soldier. If you willingly take a job as a prostitute. Anything where you are willingly taking on some sort of unvirtuous action as something that you're going to do as just part of who you are. So like butchers, soldiers, prostitutes are the general types of things. Or if you could also say if you're going to sign up for the mob or become a pickpocket or whatever, any of those different types of. Another example, maybe a better example than a prostitute might, well, maybe not. They're all bad. Sex workers or things like that. So these are the different types of wrong vows, because you're making a commitment when you sign up to do it and to engage in bad activity. Now, the person who's doing it may not feel like they have a choice, another alternative. They may not be someone who understands karmic cause and effect. They may not know what they're doing. So this means it doesn't, just because it's a wrong vow and something that we shouldn't do ourselves, is by no means saying that we shouldn't have compassion and empathy for those people who are in positions where they feel like they have to or they want to do them. There are some people who just want to grow up and be soldiers. You know, they have it in their mind from the time they're little kids, and they sign up. They go off to the Marines, and then then they're making a commitment to kill. And so that happens. And it doesn't mean that that person is necessarily a bad person. It means they've taken that wrong vow. So you have to kind of differentiate between the person and the behavior. That person is someone who's definitely worthy of compassion at the very least, and may be a good person on other ways, but we have to look at it. In general, though, what we're talking about is not looking at what other people are doing. Instead, we need to always look at ourselves. We need to make sure that, well, if I make a commitment to engage in activities such as killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and so forth, that's a wrong vow. I mean, you could make a commitment to take a job at a company that is well known for swindling its clients. White-collar crime. That's a wrong vow. Right? So you look at yourself and you you be careful about your own action. In talking about this, we're not talking about judging other people. We're talking about looking at our own motivations and correcting our own actions first. And we lead by example. You don't try to change anyone, you try to show. And as they see, they'll naturally come around, hopefully. Hopefully. Then neither. The neither here refers to mid-vows. So mid-vows are commitments that we make that can be either virtuous or unvirtuous, but they have a limited duration. A virtuous mid-vow would be, I am going to build a stupa. Once the stupa is done, then you've finished and it's over. An unvirtuous mid-vow would be, I am going to get revenge by killing my enemy. Once the enemy is killed, it's over, except their family is going to try to get you. So, something that has a limited duration. So it's neither a vow nor a mid-vow, but it does neither a vow nor a wrong vow, but it can go either way. So it's a mid-vow. So the extensive presentation now here has two topics, explaining vows in particular and explaining the three types of karma together. So we're going to talk about vows in particular first. And this has two topics, an overview and an explanation. So the overview gives you the basic idea. The explanation then goes through it in detail. The vows are individual liberation and dhyan produced and undefiled. So here we're talking about three types of vows. There are the vows of individual liberation. So these are the vows of the 5 lay precepts, monastic vows, and such. The day-long fasting vows. Then the second type are the dhyana vows. These are when you achieve the dhyana meditation, then you've given up attachment to the desire realm, and so therefore, because you don't have attachment to the desire realm, you're no longer going to engage in unvirtuous activity. So you naturally have that restraint. So here, this is where the understanding of vow is not necessarily meaning saying, I solemnly swear. It means taking that restraint. And then the third type is the undefiled, which means that when you see the path of, when you see the nature of the Four Noble Truths, there's just no way that you're going to accumulate any unvirtuous activities again. You're done with that. You've seen the harm that it brings. And so that is a restraint or vow, a restraint on your activities. So that's the undefiled vow. Those are the three types of vows: individual liberation, the dhyan produced or vows of dhyana, and the undefiled vows. The discipline that a Dharma practitioner maintains in desire, in the desire realm that is called the vow of individual liberation. So this is in the desire realm. And the discipline that dhyana primarily produces and that is effective in the form realm is called the vow of dhyana. So once you have achieved that dhyana, then you have that vow. So you are either in the form realm or your mind is resting in an equipoise on the level of form. And the undefiled discipline is called the undefiled vow. So that means basically when you see the path of seeing, as I mentioned before. I think maybe it's better to stop here because we're getting to an interesting point that I might have to go on for a while about. So it's better to stop here for this afternoon. So now let's please dedicate the virtue of teaching and listening to the Dharma to the benefit of all sentient beings so that they can swiftly achieve the liberation and omniscience. Osanam deye tam je se bani topne nye pedranam pamchene Geganachi barla trobai Sibetsole